Complete responsiveness.
Thank you, Andrea. Bye-bye, Pierre. As you noticed, we inverted the talks. We spoke about drugs, and now we'll speak about fluids. So now I will try to see with you some aspects of the prediction of fluid responsiveness and some new aspects also. So I have a conflict of interest to declare a member of the Medical Advisory Board of Pulsion. So you know that the decision of starting fluid administration should be based on the presence of three elements, which are all mandatory. The first one is the presence of hemodynamic instability or peripheral hypoperfusion, of course. Whatever, motile skin, hypotension, oliguria, hyperlactatemia, whatever. The second mandatory element should be the presence of preload responsiveness, and this is mandatory. And you know that preload responsiveness is a clinical concept or corresponding to a physiological concept. If we refer to the Frank-Starling curve and the stroke volume and the ventricular preload, you know the shape of this curve is not linear but curvilinear, and preload responsiveness corresponds to this ascending part of the curve. If you increase preload, you have an increase in stroke volume and you expect an increase in cardiac output. In the case of preload and responsiveness, if you increase preload by a fluid or whatever, you have no increase in stroke volume and no benefit expected from fluid infusion. And we know that fluid and responsiveness is a common feature in critical ill patients. And this is an analysis of the literature, now very old, we did with Frédéric Michard. And in this analysis of 400 patients, we noticed that 52% of patients responded to fluid administration. Only 52% of patients responded to fluid administration. This also means that 50% of patients do not respond. And the third element, which is also mandatory, is the presence of limited risk of fluid overload. So we need all three elements because we know that fluid overload is not good. This is one of the studies that show that a positive cumulative fluid balance could be associated with increased mortality. This is a SOAP study, but many others confirm this. So it is very important to predict fluid responsiveness, to help to choose the best fluid strategy by avoiding to give fluid and to fluid overload patients who would be fluid unresponsive, and 50% of patients are fluid unresponsive. In fact, it is impossible to use static markers of preload to predict fluid responsiveness because there is no one single Frank-Starling curve, but a family of curves between the normal heart and a failing. Oops, what happens? Excuse me. And a failing heart. In other words, if you measure preload by CVP, by whatever, you can have preload responsiveness if the heart is normal, or preload unresponsiveness if the heart is failing. So you cannot rely on markers of preload for predicting fluid responsiveness. Preload is not preload responsiveness, so you cannot rely on this kind of markers like CVP. And this was confirmed by the literature. This is a meta-analysis by Paul Merrick, co-workers, showing that in 1,800 patients and 43 studies that looked at the prediction of fluid responsiveness by CVP, the area under the ROC curve for this prediction, taking into account sensitivity and specificity, was only 0.56. And 0.56 it is very close to the 0.50. This is like tossing a coin. So it is not recommended now to predict responsiveness using CVP. It is not recommended by this consensus conference report, which was organized by the European Society of Intensive Medicine, and it is not recommended now by the Surviving Sepsis Campaign guidelines and the recent ones published some weeks ago. So it is recommended to use dynamic instead of static measures of preload. So what are dynamic indices? In fact, a dynamic index is something which can tell you about the slope of the Frank-Starling curve at the time you decide to give some treatment. So we have some dynamic indices of preload responsiveness, which could be either passive leg raising, because this is a test. You increase preload by raising the legs, and you increase preload, and you test the response in terms of stroke volume, or to use heart-lung interaction indices in patients with mechanical ventilation. So what about passive leg raising? Very briefly, this is now recommended by the Surviving Sepsis Campaign. I'm very happy about this. And what is mandatory if you perform a passive leg raising is to look at the very fast response. And you need a real-time cardiac output monitor because the effects are very transient. So you not to miss the effects, you should have a real-time monitor. And in this meta-analysis published last year with Xavier Monet and Paul Merrick, we included 21 clinical studies and almost 1,000 patients. So it's not negligible. And we found that the changes in cardiac output during this very brief maneuver of less than 1 minute during PLR can predict the responsiveness with a very good accuracy. Area under the row curve was 0.95 and the threshold value was 10%. So we were very lucky to find 10% because it is easier to remember. And the interest of this maneuver, this challenge, is that you can use it also in patients with spontaneous breathing activity. This is a paper we did a long time ago, and we use echocardiography in patients with spontaneous breathing activity, and we looked at the changes in velocity time integral as a marker of stroke volume, and we found that patients who increased during passive leg raising their velocity time integral were fluid responders, and the opposite was true, with a good accuracy and a threshold value in this study of 12%. So it is possible to use PLR in these spontaneous breathing activity conditions. Of course, we can use also heart-lung interaction indices, but only in patients with mechanical ventilation, of course. And we can, for example, pay attention to the respiratory variation of stroke volume or pulse pressure. Why pulse pressure? Because pulse pressure, which is the difference between systolic and diastolic pressure, is dependent on stroke volume, but also related to arterial compliance. If we make the assumption that compliance of the arteries doesn't change over the respiratory cycle, we can make the assumption that pulse pressure variation reflects stroke volume variation. And now it is proposed by the Surviving Sepsis Campaign, and I am also very happy with this. So if we use pulse pressure, if we have a marked pulse pressure variation, we can hypothesize that the patient is responsive and that the heart of the patient is working on the ascending part of the Frank-Starling curve, and in this condition, the patient can respond to fluid administration. If you have a low PPV, pulse pressure variation, you can hypothesize that the patient will not respond to fluid administration because of the presence of preload and responsiveness. In this old study now, we show that PPV was far better than CVP and wedge pressure to predict responsiveness. Look at the area under the row curve for PPV, which was excellent, compared to the area under the row curve for CVP and also for POP. And this was performed in patients with septic shock. And this was confirmed in many other studies. And this is a meta-analysis from China, looking at 22 studies that addressed the issue of fluid responsiveness predicted by pulse pressure variation. And more than 800 patients were included. And the threshold value was 12%, and the area under the row curve was excellent, 0.94. And now it's possible to use PPV very easily because it is incorporated in some monitors. Also, it's possible to use SVV, stroke volume variation, and this is also incorporated in some monitors. And SVV also is a good predictor of responsiveness, a little bit less good than PPV. This is meta-analysis by Paul Merrick, showing that the area under the row curve for the average area under the row curve was only 0.84, so not as good as that for PPV, or 0.84 in this other meta-analysis. But okay, it's not bad. It's not bad. Also, we can use the variability of the plethysmographic signal, using the pulse oximeter. It is a non-invasive device. Of course, it is good. This meta-analysis by the group of Massimo Antonelli from Rome. And they found the area under the curve of 0.85, which is good. Not excellent, of course, probably because some patients receive norepinephrine or vasopressors. And this is a study we did with Xavier Monet in our unit, and we showed that when the patient receives norepinephrine, the area under the row curve for the prediction of responsiveness using pleth variability index here is not as good as that for PPV and that for SVV. So we have to be very cautious if we use a PVI, pleth variability index, in the case of administration of vasopressors. Also, we can look at the variability of the inferior vena cava diameter using ultrasounds, and also it works very well in patients receiving mechanical ventilation. But we have many limitations to use all these indices in clinical practice. We cannot use in case of arrhythmias, we cannot use in case of spontaneous breathing activity, low tidal volume, low compliance of the lung, many situations which are very common in our patients. So what to do in these situations? Maybe we can use other tests. For example, we can use the end expiratory occlusion test. And this test is very easy to do. If you interrupt the ventilator at the end of expiration, you can prevent the decrease in stroke volume induced by the next breath. And therefore, the heart senses this as an increase in preload, increase in venous return, and you have just to look at the changes in stroke volume at the end of this maneuver. And the duration of this very simple maneuver is only 15 seconds, and you look at the monitor and you look at stroke volume or cardiac output, you can identify patients who are fluid responsive. This is what we did with Xavier Monet. We used a pulse contour analysis, and we found that patients who increased their cardiac output during this very brief maneuver were the same patients who were fluid responsive later, to a subsequent fluid challenge. And the opposite was true. One of the advantages of this technique, it works very well in situations where you have low length compliance, for example. This is another study we did, and we compared PPV and the area under the rocker for PPV in case of low length compliance, for example, ARDS. And as you can observe, the area is not good. And the effects of an expiratory occlusion test on pulse contour cardiac output were very good in terms of area under the rocker. So it works also in these situations of ARDS. And also you can combine two tests, an expiratory occlusion test and inspiratory occlusion test. This is what we are doing now, and this is a paper which is under revision now. We perform an expiratory occlusion test, and we found good results, good area under the curve, but also an inspiratory occlusion test. In this situation, you should expect a decrease in cardiac output in preload responders and no change in non-responders. This is what we found. And when we combine the two tests, we have a very big difference. And the threshold value was 13%. And you can use this, for example, for devices with not a good precision, with not a good precision. For example, echocardiography. You cannot rely, if you use echocardiography, you cannot rely on 5% changes because it is below the inter or intra-individual variability of the technique. But if you combine, you have 13%, it is above this variability and you can rely on. Also, you can use other tests, new tests, which are usable during low tidal volume ventilation. And for example, we know that during low tidal volume ventilation, we cannot rely on PPV. This is demonstrated by the old study by Daniel de Backer and others. But we can maybe normalize PPV by changes in esophageal pressure. This is what this team from China did recently. They look at PPV, delta PP here, and they found that the threshold value was 10%, but the area under the row curve was only 0.78, with a big, very big gray zone. Gray zone is overlap between responders and non-responders. And when they divided PPV by the changes in preload pressure, they had 2%, but a very good area under the row curve, 0.94, and a very small gray zone of only 11%. Of course, you need to measure esophageal pressure, which is not so practical in this situation, of course. Another test is tidal volume challenge. It is a new test, just published. This is what we did with an Indian group in Mumbai with Dr. Mayatra. And we looked at PPV at 6 ml per kilogram. And we confirmed that it cannot predict fluid responsiveness. Area under the curve was not good. But we performed what we call a tidal volume challenge, consisting in transiently increasing tidal volume from 6 to 8 ml per kilogram for 1 minute only. And now we have a better area under the curve for PPV 8 to predict fluid responsiveness at 6 ml. But what was better, still better, is the changes in PPV from 6 to 8, and the threshold value was 3.5. In other words, if you have a PPV of 7 and you perform this test, and PPV goes up to 11% during the test, the patient is fluid responsive at 6 ml. Okay? If PPV goes up from 7 to 9, the patient is not fluid responsive. So it is very simple to do in case of low tidal volume ventilation. And it is better to look at the changes in PPV because we have a better sensitivity, 94%, that to look at the value of PPV at 8 only, not to look at the changes, but only at 8. And finally, there is another test which consists in looking at the changes in cardiac output during lung recruitment maneuvers. And there are some papers now, one from Mathieu Bier from France. He performed a lung recruitment maneuver, CPAP of 30 centimeters water for 30 seconds, and they measured stroke volume and PPV by the ProAct device. And they showed that when you perform a lung recruitment maneuver, you observe a decrease in stroke volume or cardiac output only in responders, not in non-responders. So it is very interesting, and they had a very nice correlation between the changes in stroke volume induced by lung recruitment maneuver on the y-axis and the changes on the x-axis and the changes in stroke volume induced by fluid boluses. So it is very interesting. It is inverse correlation, of course, and they found that PPV was not good to predict responsiveness in this situation, but the changes in stroke volume induced by lung recruitment was very good to predict responsiveness. And another team also performed more or less the same study, but using continuous positive inspiratory pressure of 25 centiliters of water for 25 seconds. And they measured stroke volume by esophageal Doppler monitoring device. And also they found a very good result. Good area under the rocker for the prediction of responsiveness by looking at the changes in stroke volume induced by the lung recruitment maneuver compared to the changes in pulse pressure during the maneuver and compared to stroke volume variation. So my conclusion is that you can use as predictors of responsiveness either PPV or SVV, or the response of real-time cardiac output to passive leg raising or to end expiratory occlusion, because they are very helpful to select the best fluid strategy by identifying patients eligible for fluid infusion, and importantly, by avoiding to fluid overload patients who would be fluid unresponsive. And in case of low tidal volume ventilation, new tests such as the tidal volume challenge or the hemodynamic response to lung recruitment maneuver help to reliably predict responsiveness. So thank you very much.